look at Nehemiah, right? What was he? He was a wine tester. No, he was more than that. He was the cupbearer to the king. He was an assistant. He was a trusted advisor, right? Food didn't get to the king except through Nehemiah. And what did he do? He built a wall around Jerusalem. What about Esther? What risk did she take? As the queen, she approached the king without his permission. That was a great risk. Right? What about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were basically Ivy League students, and their risk-taking was in the type of food they chose to eat. Right? Those are risk takers there. What about David? What was his risk? He took the risk in killing Goliath, in facing Goliath when nobody else, professional soldiers, were afraid of facing Goliath. And what was he? He was a shepherd boy. And in this case, he was the UPS man, right? He was sent over, deliver some cheeses and some food, and check on his brothers, right? That's a pretty lowly job. So one thing in common with all these folks is they all had secular jobs. They were in the marketplace. And something else is they had a commonality of boldness. They did not have a spirit of fear and timidity, right? I'm referencing 2 Timothy 1:7, right? I'm not talking about foolish risk-taking that I would push you guys to do. I don't want that, right? It's altogether different from the type of adrenaline rush thrill that the world would have. That's not what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to be bold in biblical risk-taking in a way that points to Christ. So how do you tell whether the risk that you're taking in the marketplace is biblical boldness or just adrenaline rush seeking or foolishness, right? So the way I would say it is you have to test your heart. Now, the Bible says that in Jeremiah 17:9 that the heart is deceitful above all else. Who can understand it? That's definitely the case, right? So it doesn't mean that just because you check your heart and you feel that you're doing the right thing, that you're right. I mean, I remember Jonah, when he fled, right? He had lots of peace about his decision. He was able to sleep very, very well, right? In the midst of the storm. That didn't make it right, right? So our heart's deceitful. You got to check it out. Don't just check your heart and say, okay, therefore it's right. I'm going to go ahead and do it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean we can't know what it is. So, for example, Proverbs 20, verse 5, right? The purpose in the man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So through wisdom, you can kind of ask yourself, well, why do I want to do this? You can ask yourself 20 questions. You can kind of pigeonhole yourself. You can kind of check yourself, right? Or Paul says in 2 Corinthians 13, right? Test yourselves. Examine yourselves. Why would he do that unless the ability to check ourselves is doable, right? Another one comes from 1 Samuel 17. I get this. This popped out at me. This is when David was seeking to slay Goliath, right? His brother goes up to him and says, "You have a wicked heart," right? Here, let me read the exact phrase. It's in 1 Samuel 17. So I'm going to just paraphrase this for you because it's quite harsh what his older brother said. He said, "Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David," right? And he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. If you've come down to see the battle, you're just looking for, you're just checking stuff out. You're an evil guy, David." And what does David say? "What have I done now? Wasn't that but a word?" And he turned away. Right? So somehow David knew that when somebody accused him of having an evil heart, he's like, no, that's not right. And we know David is a man after God's own heart. Right? That's written for us. So test your heart. And then my next point would be, do you have the right goal? Why are you taking a risk? Like, what's the aim of this, right? And when I look at Nehemiah, right, how does his story go? He hears from his brother that Jerusalem does not have its walls. It's basically like a guy walking around the streets without his pants on. It's shameful, right? And he was broken from it. And he loved God's name and God's fame. And if you look at the way he prayed in Nehemiah 1, he appealed to God for that. So his goal was God's name, God's fame, right? Not himself. Okay? What about Esther, right? As a queen, what was her goal? Why did she take the risk, right? Was it for the thrill of it? No. It was to save God's people, right? Haman was going to have the Jews genocide, right? They were going to kill them all, wipe out all the Jews. So she stepped in because she loved God's people. That was her goal, right? What about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do you think it's really because they didn't like pork and they didn't like wine? No, that would be far too superficial. It's because they loved God's law, right? They meditated on it. They realized, hey, this is how we're raised, this is what we're taught, and we're going to stick to this. And David, when he's fighting against Goliath and going for that risk, right? How does he address the Philistine, right? You uncircumcised Philistine, how dare you, right, come against the living God? It's for God's name and fame again. God's name is at stake, and what do people of biblical boldness do? They take a risk and they take action. My next one is, are you doing this for a reward, right? Are you doing this for selfish reasons? See, the Bible condemns self-centeredness, right? So in 1 Corinthians 13, it's what love is not self-seeking, right? Philippians 2:3, get rid of selfish ambition, right? But here's a part that I really want to focus on. It's not so much that I don't want you to take a risk for reward. My main point actually is that if you take a risk and you're not seeking a reward, something is wrong. If you're not chasing after reward. This popped out at me and kind of freaked me out when I was in college. I'll read to you from Nehemiah, right? So we know the story of Nehemiah, and we know how he built God's wall, right? And throughout it, he says several things that kind of made me think, Nehemiah, you don't really mean to say this, okay? So he does all this stuff, and in Nehemiah 5:19, he says, in a short prayer, basically, remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. So Nehemiah 1, those type of prayers, I can see people praying that. But wow, 5:19, that kind of surprised me. And then when I go to 13, verse 14, that surprised me again. He says, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. All right? Verse 22, then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. All right? Even though he's kind of like the governor, he's getting them to do Levitical stuff. And then Nehemiah says this, remember this also, my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. What? All right? And then verse 31, he ends this way. The book of Nehemiah ends this way. Remember me, O my God, for good. Nehemiah, how is this possible? You're embarking on this huge undertaking of building a wall for Jerusalem, for God's name, and 4 times you ask God to remember you? Right? For what? This seems so self-centered, right? And then 2 times in 6:14 and 13:29, he says, God, remember them for doing evil. So it's not just remember me for good, remember them for doing evil. And I didn't really know how to process it. It's just so anti-Asian, right? Now, when I read David and Goliath, right, another thing struck out at me that just surprised me. Okay, so I'm going to go back to 1 Samuel 17 and peel this out for you guys. 1 Samuel 17, verse 24 to 27. So if you think about it, David is a shepherd boy doing an errand for his older brothers, who are the men of war, right? He's not supposed to be fighting. How in the world does he end up fighting Goliath, right? There's thousands of people there. How in the world does that guy end up fighting Goliath? So this is how it works. See if you can pick it out, okay? All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. I'll translate that for you. You'll get very wealthy. You'll get to marry the king's daughter, the princess, right? And you will not have to pay taxes. Your whole family won't have to pay taxes. That's pretty nice, right? And what does David do? Right? Verse 26. And David said to the man who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Right? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him the same way, so shall it be done to the man who kills him. And then verse 28, that's when his older brother gets mad. So David hears this reward, then asks him, hey, what's the reward? Boom, 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 boom. It's exactly what I just heard. It's not like I heard it out of context. It's a different thing. And then in verse 30, after he just ignores his brother, and he turned away from him toward another. So David does this again, and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So they again tell him, hey, this is the reward. Tons of money, you marry the princess, and no taxes. Verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. The way David got to kill Goliath, the means of it was because he kept asking what the reward was. How in the world is this biblical? Is this something we should simply ignore, like David having multiple wives? Is this something that's not for us, right? And I wrestled with that, and I didn't think that was the case. So I'm going to make my case why I don't think that's the case. So I'm going to look at another man first, right? You look at Moses, right? I want to tie this from the Old Testament to the New Testament so that I can make my case that this is something that we ought to fully emulate, right? So Exodus 2:15, we all know the story of Moses, right? So Moses sees that this Hebrew guy is being mistreated, right? And then looks, I'll just read it. He looked this way and that, verse 12, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And then later on, somebody finds out about it, and in verse 15, what happens? When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by the well. So I used to read this, and I go, well, Moses simply ran away because he was scared, right? And this isn't really something that is that good. I'm not telling you guys to kill people, right? It's just not. It's not like a good thing to remember of Moses. But then I looked at Hebrews 11, right? And verse 24. This is in hindsight, right? With the authority of Scripture, right? From the author of Hebrews. And what does he say about Moses? By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So somewhere along the lines, he identified himself not as Egyptian, but as Jewish. He already did something before he killed the guy, which put him along the bad side of the administration. Right? And why did he do that? He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So these saints were motivated by reward, and they simply said the reward that Egypt, that Ramses, or another pharaoh, whoever it was, could offer me is nothing like the reward of Christ. Here's another one, right? To make it crystal clear that I think it's very, very good to chase a reward. And if you're taking a risk that's completely selfless, you simply don't have the right reward in mind, and the selflessness one is simply a mask for unbiblical reward seeking. That's what I think. So here's the verse, okay? Jesus speaking this time. Love your enemies. Do good. Lend, expecting nothing in return. And your reward will be great. So when I see verses like that, Jesus giving me a command and giving me a carrot, I cannot simply say, okay, Jesus, I'm not going to take that carrot. You're giving me the carrot because you want me to have the carrot, right? Why? Why would God do this, right? So when I look at, I see the answer in John 5:44. Let's see, John 5:44. It goes like this. He's talking to the Pharisees, right? How can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? See, we're all glory seekers. We're all praise seekers. Wanting the praise of man is wrong. Wanting praise is not wrong. It should be, we want the praise of God. We want his approval. See, when I drink this and I go, yummy, I am saying this cup of 100% organic carrot juice is yummy. If I take a soda and I drink and I go, corn syrup, soda, I don't want this, right? I'm dissing that and I'm praising this. When we seek a reward that comes from God, we make God look great. When we seek no reward, we're saying God's not worthy. So this is why you must seek a reward. My next point is that when you're doing risk-taking, right, besides having the right goal, besides seeking reward, the question I would have is, do you recognize your sin? Right? See, Nehemiah in chapter 1, when he saw Jerusalem with its pants down, he prayed. And his prayer was not a prayer of, God, I'm holy, those guys sinned. His prayer was the sins, my sins, and that of my father and my house. He never pulled a Pharisee there. He always recognized that he was part of the problem, right? Even though he lived a blameless life, even though in that same book he can keep saying, God, remember me for my good, he still recognized the sin in him. Daniel, a man loved by God, right? He could pray and then an angel would come down and touch him, right? And what does he do in Daniel 9 verse 5? He says, we have sinned. Daniel, you didn't eat that food. There's nothing recorded in the book of Daniel that slights him in any way. What did he ever do wrong? And yet he recognized his brokenness and sin. So when you do risk-taking, you must be like that. You must have a disposition of seeing your brokenness, seeing your depravity, right? That humbles us, right? Here's a great man who saw that. His name was the Apostle Paul, right? What does he call himself? In 1 Corinthians 15:9, least of the apostles, right? Amongst those heroes, I'm the last dude. And then what does he say in Ephesians 3:8? Amongst all the saints, amongst the elect, amongst everyone who's going to heaven, I'm least. And then 1 Timothy 1:15, I'm the worst of all sinners, anyone who's ever lived. Wow. That's categorically putting himself in a very, very low place. So to summarize it, in risk-taking, after testing your heart, right, for the right goal, are you seeking reward? Do you recognize your sin? My admonition to you guys is, at that point, just do it, right? If you choose to do nothing, you are doing something, right? There's no neutral ground in action, right? Now, I see this all the time, right? There's a word in the secular world we call analysis paralysis, right? It is a form of action. You're just constantly analyzing, right? And you don't see that the cost of inaction as as worse than doing something. So that's why you're there. Now, I want to balance this out first. Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. I would consider that an action. You are being still. You're choosing at that point to sit there and wait on God. That's perfectly fine. Or Exodus 14:14, right? God will fight for us. You only have to be silent. Just watch. God's going to do the amazing things. You don't have to do anything. So that's absolutely biblical. But I want to balance it out, because I see far more of this side than the other side in my circles. And I love this verse. It's something you would expect out of a Braveheart movie, but that's why I love the Bible. There's something in it for everyone, right? So this is Joab, and they're fighting the Ammonites, right? And he's telling his brother. He says this: "Be strong, and let us use our strength for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." He knows the result is not his, right? So it's just so action oriented, right? Here's one from Nehemiah, right? When he's encouraging the people. Nehemiah 4:13-15. So this is when opposition's coming, and he's telling them, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to come together. We're going to have swords. We're going to still keep building. And his encouragement to them is this: "And I looked, and I arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes.'" So both are biblical. There's a time to trust God and do nothing, and there's a time to trust God and do something. Now, the thing I really am fighting against is Proverbs 26:13, where the sluggard says, "There's a lion on the street," and basically it's an excuse after excuse for why you're not going to take action. And that's what I'm really fighting after. So, I mean, there's, you look at Nehemiah and building the wall, David and Goliath, right? Those are men who took action. Now, when you act, expect opposition, okay? What opposition did Nehemiah see, right? He had to deal with outside forces. He had to deal with false Jews, right, or false believers, right? These were traitors who did not have Israel's interest in mind. David, with his brother, his own older brother, right? Most people would have just said, okay, big brother said not to do it, I'll just sit around, right? He's like, no, I'm going to go do this, right? He's defying God. No one else is willing to stand up. And why are we surprised at opposition, right? Jesus said we would testify before the world. And the means of this testifying is through opposition, right? If there's no opposition, where does a chance of testifying come from, right? Paul, it was through jail, right? And a lot of people these days who testify, they're not clergy. In Luke 21, this is a phrase that always surprised me. I got this from John Piper. I didn't see this myself. Okay, so he probably got it from somebody else. Okay, so this is how it goes. In verse 16, because we all got this from Jesus, right? Jesus says, "You'll be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death." Right? So your own siblings are going to kill you, get you killed. "You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish." All right? So you can lose your head, but keep all your hair. Right? That's so strange, right? When there's opposition, right? Things like that happen. Remember Jesus' words to Peter, "You follow me," right? And that's what I want you guys to do. Just follow Jesus, right? And think of the inner circle of Jesus, right? Who was his inner circle? Peter, James, and John. What happens to James? He gets killed right away in Acts. What? Jesus, why'd you invest so much time in your inner circle? Shouldn't that guy live very, very long so you can promote your teachings all the way? And God lets his inner circle guy die like that. Peter lives a bit longer, but he still gets killed. And John lives so long that they have to exile him, right? 3 people from the inner circle, 3 different ways of dying. All right? And all of them just follow, the command was just follow me. You follow me, right? We look at Joseph, we look at Daniel, we look at Nehemiah. These are guys that had, and Esther, that had great outcomes. But then we know in Hebrews 11, there were many that were sawn in two, right? We know that in the face of opposition, right, and possibly through death, right, for some of us, right, and through that death, we point to Christ as gain. See, the way we magnify Christ is we show that everything else on earth is rubbish in comparison to him. That to die is gain, to be with Christ is far better, right? Moses, right, Hebrews 11, he saw Christ. It says that. He saw Christ, right, far away, not as clearly as we see Christ through the scriptures. Right? It's plain as it can be in Philippians, right? And that's how we magnify Christ. Just show that he's more worthy than all else. Now, who rules this world? Okay, obviously God. He's sovereign, right? What does Jesus say? All authority has been given to me, right? Of course. Jesus, before Pontius Pilate, what does he say? Right, you have no authority over me unless it was given to you, right? Of course. God's in control. And then Revelation 13:7. That one always surprised me. How does this work? Revelation 13:7. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. So somebody gave that authority, right? And the authority for Satan to wreak havoc on the church. God is fully in control, and in that case, God says, Satan, you can go ahead and wreak havoc, right? Or you can see it in the temptation of Jesus. Jesus did not rebuke Satan for this, right? So what does Satan say? Satan basically says, hey, I'll make you king of everything, basically. Right? Here's the exact phrase. And he said to him, to you I will give authority and all their glory, all the nations, right? He showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. For it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. Jesus doesn't rebuke him for that. Right? And of course, in a certain sense, Satan is in control right now. 2 Corinthians 4:4, he's the god of this age, right? And what does Jesus say? His kingdom is not of this world. Now, ultimately, God is in control because in Romans it says, every authority is established by God. So God establishes all. He permits it, right? And in this age, Satan's in control. So why is this important? If Satan is in control now, right? If he's the god of this age, that means if you follow Christ, eventually you're going to break some laws, right? If the kingdom of this world is Christ's already, then all the laws would be very Christ-oriented. But they're not going to be, right? Because Jesus isn't back yet, right? I'll show you Esther 4:16. And as Chinese people, or sorry, not Chinese, but as Asians, sometimes we're so like, okay, follow everything, right? This is what Esther says. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. See, Esther wasn't the first queen. There was another queen called Vashti. She disobeyed the king, and she was ousted and replaced with the next Miss Persia Mede Empire, right? And Esther happened to be the one for now, but she could be easily replaced. They could hold another beauty pageant, right? And the law says you can't go to the king. The king has to come to you, right? And she was willing to break that law. Or Obadiah, right? He lived during King Ahab's time, and Jezebel had a bunch of true Jews killed. And what does Obadiah do? He hid 102 caves and fed them, right? Here's a civil servant, right? Breaking the law. And you think it was a big deal. Elijah himself, after he slayed 450 plus 400 of the Baal prophets, the minute Jezebel said, I'm going to kill you, Elijah freaks out, right? Jezebel is a woman to be feared, right? She has power. And Obadiah broke those laws, and he kept 100 alive. What about Rahab? It was an act of treason for her to keep the spies alive. Why? Because she saw the fame of God's amazing acts in Egypt, and through faith decided to be a worshiper of God, and turned against her own people and against her own false gods. Right? And what does she get as a return for her reward? I think she's a direct parent of Jesus, if you look at the lineage. Right? I think there's only a couple women. I think Rahab might be one of them. I'll have to double check on that. That's pretty cool, right? In any case, even if I'm quoting that part wrong, she's in the Hall of Faith. I'm not going to be in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. Pretty cool for being a prostitute. Right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What do? Besides the eating, the music plays. And what do? They're willing to do it anyways. And when they speak to Nebuchadnezzar and they're thrown in the fire, they basically say, hey, my God is able to save us. But even if he doesn't, right? What does Daniel do when the laws are made so that he's not allowed to pray? He opens the window and does the same stuff, right? Perhaps Moses, right, in killing that man. I'll bring some other secular examples. I guess not secular, but just non-biblical examples. Martin Luther King, right? He was breaking some laws, right? Rosa Parks, she broke some laws. Here's another guy I really love. I found this in like a Time or Newsweek article once, and his name is John Rankin, and the secular folks were praising him for muscular Christianity. So he was a Presbyterian pastor, part of the Underground Railroad, and he had a lot of guns, and he had a lot of sons. So when slaves made it through, they made it there, they would defend them, and they would have their guns pointed at them. Don't come any further, right? These guys are free. Or another guy that evangelicals love that we love, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The guy was a pacifist, right? And he's written great books on grace and the church. And he tried to bomb Hitler. How in the world does that happen, right? We live in extraordinary times, right? We may not think so, but we do. That's the White House a few months ago. We're in gross rebellion against God, right? If you think about why this issue matters so much, you can look at 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. There's a bunch of sins that are listed. Stealing, greediness, adultery, blah, blah, a bunch of those things. But no one is calling those things good. That's why this issue is different. It's gross rebellion against God, right? God is the creator, and we're taking away or attempting to take away even that ability from God. It's ultimate rebellion against God. Here's another one. This is a chart of China's population pyramid. So the 1950s, these folks are young and old. So the chart goes from age 0 to 100, right? So obviously that makes sense. You have more kids and you have that. And then slowly, through policy, it starts shrinking, right? And it's more like a popsicle now. And then by 2060, it looks, pretty awful, right? But if you think about that, if that 2060 is going to look like that, like a sword, instead of a pizza slice, all those people on that side were either killed or just, they were never made, right? So they say, this is from the Chinese Health Ministry, right, from the Financial Times, just came out recently, 330 million abortions, right? If you think about the sheer number of that, that's the entire population of the U.S., right, in the last couple of decades. And how do they enforce this, right? This is from the Washington Post from just a few days ago, October 30th. And this is from a guy who was part of the Chinese government who enforced this. He said, many women who were 7 or 8 months pregnant were forced to have abortions. The man said, speaking on the condition of anonymity, hospitals never refused, despite the risks, because it was a government order. No one dared say no. One woman with 2 daughters fled her home to avoid litigation because she wanted a son. When the family planning team arrived at her house, they found only the woman's 80-year-old mother. They tore down the dwelling, destroyed the furniture, and ruined the food, making the house vanish in just 20 minutes, the man said. I told an official in charge, this is too ruthless. He replied, it's policy. This guy, who's now the former team member, said, I can never forget the scene, an 80-year-old woman crying in front of her ruined house, sitting on a stone in tears. It's like it just happened yesterday. I couldn't bear it anymore and resigned from the family planning team. If we think of the Holocaust, 6 million people, right? 6 million Jews. This is like a Chinese self-inflicted Holocaust. And the numbers are staggering, right? But let's not look at stats. Her name is Fang Jinmei. June 2nd, 2012, 7 months pregnant. They kept hounding her. She was 22 years old. She had her first kid at 16 or 17, and the law says you have to wait 5 years. And so she did. So she actually complied by all the laws. And they still said, no, you shouldn't have a kid. She ran away. As a 7-month-old pregnant woman, she had to go from house to house. This is all on Wikipedia. She hid for 14 hours on the side of a road to try to escape the authorities. And eventually, they found her in the house. They beat her up. They took her thumb and forced her to sign the consent and injected something into her kid and delivered a stillborn, right? This is the time we live in. Yeah, it breaks my heart because my kids were born in 2012. I want to present a few more cases closer to home. I don't even know her name, but she's from New Mexico, 2006. She was filming and she had certain convictions, and the state said you can't have those convictions. She was fined a couple $1,000s. I think it was $7,000. This guy's July 2012 in Colorado. I guess he's a baker. Also fined. This couple from Oregon, July 2015, fined about $200,000 and given a gag order that they're not allowed to even talk about this stuff. It's so weird. And they're not even going after their business. They're going after their personal property. That's like Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. These guys aren't just going to lose their business. I mean, they're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their homes because they believe this. They're going to make examples of us, right? A few weeks ago, I got to meet Randy Alcorn, and I didn't even know who he was. I feel ashamed of it. I asked him for a ride. Anyways, I thought he was just a fictional writer, and then we went to our destination, and he wasn't able to give me a ride. He was too busy, but he really tried. Anyways, we ended up at the retreat, and I got to hear his story. I was like, what? He was in the 80s, I think, really into the pro-life movement, and he never hurt anyone. He just didn't want the abortions to go on, so he did some stuff like to stop the path toward an abortion clinic, and the laws and the judges like fined him. So it was like he owed the abortion clinic money. It was a ton of money. I think at one point it was like $8 million in damages or something. That's how high it got. It was ridiculous. And he got a letter basically saying the court's now going to garnish your wages as a pastor. But by providence, that letter never got to the church somehow. It's providence. An angel must have been like, that's not going out. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the state wants. When an angel gets involved, it's not happening the way the state wants to happen. And he talked to some people and quit his job, so he got all that money. So he never paid a dime to the abortion clinic. But as a result, he lived on minimum wage for years. And because if he made money, that money would go to an abortion clinic. And all of his books that he writes, all of the royalties, 100% of it goes toward missions, so that none of it can go to an abortion clinic. He's been doing that for years. And he's given away like $8 million or something toward missions. You can read his article, find out more about him on Christianity Today and some other articles. And man, that was pretty cool. Here's another one. His name is Ronnie Smith. He died December 2013. That's his wife and his son, Hosea. The reason this story gripped me so much was because our kids are about the same age. That's usually what grips me, because I have a love for my children that I never knew existed. And just looking at his hands, I saw that. And I thought, what if I could never play with my son again? Would I say Christ is gain? And he was married for 10 years, which is about how long I've been married, or plus or minus a few years. And he was a really good chemistry teacher. So he went to Libya, taught at a school there. He wanted to either pursue his PhD or go to seminary, but instead he went to Libya, and he was an awesome teacher. And this is a quote from one of the newspaper articles. He was a teacher who offered private tutoring when others had given up. Smith pushed them, demanding hard work and success. His testimony was he loved the kids who were not good at chemistry, and he was just awesome at it, at his trade, chemistry. And because of all the Al-Qaeda stuff, they just wanted to target Americans. And one day he was running. He sent his wife and kids back home a few weeks earlier because he had to stay back and grade finals paperwork. And they just shot him many times. And when I looked for an image for Ronnie Smith and I clicked on Google Images, they had taken his body, and I guess they took it to a morgue, and the people there shot tons of pictures of it and put it online to desecrate. And basically flaunt him. Sort of like how if you would kill somebody, you drag his body across the street to humiliate them. They did that on the internet. It's still there. I'm not going to post that stuff. But he'll have a new body. One like Jesus's. Oh. Here's another man. His name is Peter Hahn. During the 1994 Northridge earthquake, he lost everything. He's a Korean American. He lost everything. And he was living the Korean American dream, which is you buy a house, then you take the down payment, you buy another house, you keep doing that, you rent it out, and so forth. But from the earthquake, he wasn't able to make the payments, bam, because he didn't have earthquake insurance. So he lost it all. The government gave him a $500,000, 0% interest loan. And he realized, and then he ended up taking a mission trip to China, near North Korea. And he realized, even though he grew up at the church, up until then, he didn't know Christ. It was all just for money. And he's done some crazy things. So he took that loan that the government gave him, bought a 5-story building and in China, right across the border from North Korea, And from that, he ended up teaching people how to cut hair, how to learn English, how to all those basic life skills, how to bake stuff, and that became a really good testimony to China. And then from that, he used that as a bridge to do marketplace stuff in North Korea. So he noticed that for North Koreans, it was very hard for them to get food. One, they're not farming very much, so they have to go, just pick whatever grows naturally. But you can only walk so far. So he ended up establishing a bus line so that North Koreans could pack themselves in there and go farther. And then they'd go, much farther, sleep on a plastic bag if they needed to, and then they'd pick more stuff and they'd take the bus back. So he created a bus route. And then he saw there were starving people there. So somehow he's able to feed 22,000 people, little kids, a day with a daozheng and a bo bao. It's like a little bun and a soy milk. And it costs him tens of thousands of dollars. I have no idea how he does this. When I look at his life and how he was able to do that, it's like Jesus multiplying fish. It's like Jesus saying, greater things will you do. It's amazing. And then, for some odd reason, around 2014, because of geopolitical stuff, the Chinese government said he stole money, blah, blah, did a bunch of bad stuff, and shut down his operation. Took away that 5-story building and threw him in jail. Because he's an old guy, right? Well, he's not that old, but he's not, young. And he spent a year in a Chinese jail with trumped-up charges. And right before they released him, they had to ask him what he was doing, why they were there. And he got to share his testimony in 3 languages. In Korean, because in that part of China, the language even of the government courts is in Korean and not Mandarin. Okay? Just like how when you go to southern China, some stuff happens in Cantonese and not Mandarin, because that's their heart language. And they translated it in Mandarin. And because he's an American citizen, they translated it in English. And you can Google his name, Hahn, Peter, and then just look for a New York Times or Associated Press, and you'll see it. I see Paul in this man. And their goal was to stop all the activities, but it's flourished, even though he's not there anymore. God, in his providence, has found a way and made those things work even more. Here's another family, Matt and Grace. You guys have probably heard of them. He moved in 2012 to Qatar, or Qatar, I forgot how they say it, to help build water refinery stuff for the World Cup in 2022. It's a Stanford grad, right? I remember the first time I heard their story, I just saw their picture. This is an Asian kid with a Stanford hat is like your mother's dream, right? That is awesome. The other part is not your mother's dream. You can feel the pressure. I think if I had married somebody, I felt so much pressure growing up, and not that, anyways, I couldn't even marry somebody who's Chinese. I married somebody who speaks Cantonese, it's as close as I could. And if I had gone farther out in the Asian circle, it'd probably have been looked down upon. If I had gone white, really looked down upon. If I'd gone black, that would have been really looked down upon. This is a reality. Every race is racist, and Chinese people or Asians are quite racist. It's just reality. For them to be able to then adopt 3 kids from Ghana, that's amazing. I looked at the picture. I'm like, they're Christians. There's no way they would do it any other way, right? And I only had contact with them without seeing them in person. And I finally did meet them later on, and all the assumptions I had about them proved true. They're in Qatar, and their middle daughter, Gloria, right there, died. She had lots of issues where she came from, of starvation. So she was just used to not eating for days, and then she would binge from garbage, literally garbage. And so she would have to, lock down the garbage, not let them have access to it, and then for days sometimes they wouldn't eat. And then one day she died. The authorities were not happy with this family. It just didn't look right to them. It was spiritual warfare. And they wanted to give them the death penalty for child trafficking, for the harvesting of organs. That's what they said they were doing, that they were really going to Africa, adopting these kids, and then they were going to sell their organs. All right? And throughout their ordeal, you can read it, there were authorities in Qatar that wanted them out, that were okay with it, and there were authorities that stopped them and said, no, we're going to get these people killed. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to give them the death penalty. And one day, when they were finally freed, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, walked them to the airport, and even then, they were able to stop them, and they had to plead with him again. Even John Kerry pled for this family. Eventually, they were able to leave, but they spent a year in jail, or about 11 months in jail, and then about a year in house arrest. Right? You're not getting paid. His employer ended up cutting ties with him. That's a sacrifice. So that's my talk. I'm pointing to Christ in the marketplace in extraordinary times.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.